Hello and welcome to Hamilton the Podcast from Graphomania Podcast Network. I'm Robbie Herlocker.
And I'm Vinton Bain.
Today is the second of our increasingly misnamed 10-minute history episodes. We may actually get into the 10-minute time frame, though, this time, because, Vinton, we know that of the two of us, I am the more long-winded.
Well, I don't know. If I'm backed into a corner, I can talk a lot.
That's actually true. That is true. But I won't try to back you into the corner right now. But you will be the one who is leading this for the most part because you've done a lot of research into this guy named Crispus Attucks. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay, so what brought this guy from American history into your view, onto your radar?
Well, it was watching the Netflix original Marvel TV show Luke Cage.
Why am I not surprised?
I am a big comic book fan, as are you, Robbie. So, Of course, whenever these Netflix shows come out, we devour them and we eat up every bit of information that they have to give us. And one of the bits of information that Luke Cage had to give me was this man named Crispus Attucks.
So give us a little bit of context for how Luke Cage in the TV show brings up this character from American history.
So in the show, there is a moment where Luke Cage is being held at gunpoint in front of this building named after Crispus Attucks. And he says to the man holding him at gunpoint, "Do you even know who Crispus Attucks was? A free black man, the first black man to die for what became America. He could have acted scared when those Brits raised their guns, blended in the crowd, but he stepped up. He paid with his life, but he started something."
So Luke Cage obviously has a lot of respect for this patriot, Crispus Attucks. What is it, Vinton, that we know about Crispus Attucks?
Well, we don't actually know a lot about him. We think he was born around 1723 in Massachusetts to Prince Younger, who was a slave from Africa, and Nancy Attucks, a Natick Indian. One of the few pieces of history that we have that we think is connected to Attucks is an ad placed by a white landowner in 1750 offering to pay 10 pounds for the return of a young runaway slave. The ad said, quote, "Ran away from his master, William Brown, Framingham, on the 30th of September last. A mulatto fellow about 27 years of age, named Crispus, 6 feet 2 inches high, short curled hair," unquote.
So Crispus is sometimes identified as a freed slave or as a runaway slave, but if this is true and this ad relates to him, do we know whether Crispus was ever caught?
Well, it seems that he had escaped for good. He would work the next 2 decades at sea and on docks. He found himself in Boston early in 1770, having returned from a voyage in the Bahamas, and was due to leave shortly afterwards on a ship for North Carolina. But it was at this time that the tensions between the colonists and the British soldiers were growing to a breaking point. And on March 5th, 1770, the Boston Massacre occurred. Now, we've talked about the Boston Massacre on the podcast before, but as a reminder, Robbie, what can you tell us about this historical event?
I thought that I was supposed to be asking the questions here. You did the research.
I'm just flipping it on you.
Oh, no. So the Boston Massacre was this moment where, like you said, the tensions between the colonists and the British soldiers were super, super intense. So you had gone through the Stamp Act, you had the Townshend Act, which was supposed to be a little bit softer, but people were still really mad about the tariffs and the taxation that was on the colonies. And as a result of this tension, the British Crown had sent a bunch of soldiers there to march through the streets of Boston, which just made the situation worse because you had the situations where the colonists and the British soldiers were constantly getting up in arms with each other, constantly getting in arguments with each other. Some people thought the colonists were having their jobs taken away by the British soldiers who were taking second jobs in the area. And there was an event a couple weeks before the Boston Massacre where this kid was shot by a British officer outside of his window. And so there's a lot of really high tension where there are people here that are angry that the British government is not respecting the Bostonians as British citizens, and they're instead treating them as second-hand citizens under martial law. So here at the Boston Massacre, the beginning of March 1770, you have this situation where the British soldiers somehow open fire onto a mob or a peaceful group, depending on which side of the argument you listen to. This group of citizens is attacked by the British officers and the British soldiers. And in that encounter, we get to see multiple perspectives, and there's a court case in which John Adams represents the British soldiers, saying that the British soldiers acted in self-defense against a mob that was throwing ice and stones and bringing clubs and was actually inciting the violence themselves. And so John Adams, our second president, was involved in this trial to see what would happen here. And as I remember, Crispus Attucks was actually one of the first people gunned down in the Boston Massacre. Is that right?
That's right. That's exactly the moment that Luke Cage was talking about in the show. And this event obviously is one of those events that sparked the colonists into the flames of the Revolutionary War.
So as you said, Vinton, we have discussed the Boston Massacre a little bit more in depth on one of our John Adams episodes. So if you're interested in going back and listening to that, we'll put a link to the episode in our show notes for this because we don't have time. We're already going to pass the 10-minute mark for this 10-minute history. We're running out of time. We're running and our time's up. Eyes up. We've got to keep going through this episode. So during the trial about the Boston Massacre, did our man John Adams actually mention Crispus Attucks?
He did, actually. Adams claimed that Attucks helped lead an unruly mob against the soldiers, forcing them to open fire. On the flip side of that, Samuel Adams claimed that Attucks was simply leaning on a stick, quote unquote, when the gunshot erupted.
On the one hand, you have Sam Adams representing the Sons of Liberty saying he's just leaning on a stick. He just needed support like a crutch, and you attacked him. And then John Adams says he was in a mob, and so you have those heightened arguments back and forth, back and forth.
The 8 soldiers involved in their captain are going to be acquitted, as we know from our talk about this previously. John Adams wins the case.
But you do see 2 guys with their thumbs branded in court.
Right, you do. And what we do know for sure is that Crispus Attucks was gunned down that day. He took 2 ricocheted bullets in the chest and was the first of 5 men to die, making him the first casualty of the American Revolution. And the city leaders at the time waived the segregation laws that were in place and permitted Attucks to be buried with the other victims in Boston's Granary Burying Ground.
That's right, because they often had separate cemeteries for people of color and for white people at the time, right?
That's right.
So we know that the Boston Massacre was used for the next several years to incite patriotic fervor among the colonists. You have people looking back and saying, what about Boston? Look at the cost and all that we've lost. And you have people reminding us that the Boston Massacre was a huge event. And as early as the exact week of the massacre itself, Paul Revere publishes an artist's depiction of this event, painting the British soldiers as the aggressive people, not acting in self-defense, but firing on a defenseless mob. And so this publication went out, and everyone in the colonies saw this attack and got angry about it. So we've already discussed a lot of the ways that the Boston Massacre helped to inspire and drive the American Revolutionary War. But what about Crispus Attucks has lingered in the rest of American history? What is Crispus Attucks' legacy?
Right. Well, he would be brought back up in the years leading to the Civil War by abolitionist William Cooper Nell. In 1851, Nell and others petitioned for a monument in Boston to Crispus Attucks, recognizing him as one of the first martyrs of the American Revolution. The monument would finally be created in 1888, and Attucks was featured prominently in it. Nell also organized a memorial celebration of Crispus Attucks and worked to have Crispus Attucks Day designated in Boston. Being outraged by a U.S. Supreme Court ruling in 1857, which said that ethnic Africans had no legal standing in the United States as they were not considered citizens under the Constitution, Nell fought to remind people of the African Americans that fought for independence and helped have Attucks recognized in the commemoration of the Boston Massacre.
Talking about holidays and American history, I would much rather celebrate Crispus Attucks Day than, say, Columbus Day in the United States.
Thank you.
That'd be wonderful. So what else in American history has brought up Attucks' legacy?
Well, in 1964, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. mentioned Attucks in his book, Why We Can't Wait, praising him for his moral courage and his defining role in American history.
So we've seen a couple key moments in history where Crispus Attucks has been brought up. What about in modern day times?
Well, We, as Hamilton fans, love mixing our history with hip hop.
Who wouldn't?
And in that fashion, in February 2012, Wayne Brady appeared in a satirical rap music video about Crispus Attucks for Funny or Die, parodying Ice Cube's Today Was a Good Day.
Oh, I have not heard. I mean, I've heard Ice Cube's Today Was a Good Day, but I have not heard this parody.
It's really funny. You should look it up after this. I'll put a link to it in the show notes.
Sounds good.
Other than that, there's the Luke Cage show, of course, where I first heard the name. The showrunner for Luke Cage, Cheo Hodari Coker, did an interview with TVGuide.com where he said, quote, "I wanted to talk about the first person to die for a revolution and what that meant and what he sacrificed. When you look at what happened, Attucks could have very easily laid in the cut, as Luke says. He stepped up, though. We use Crispus Attucks for that because half of these kids haven't even heard of Crispus Attucks. It's really the power of music and of entertainment, of film and television. You get to tell stories and history that people have not really thought about in a long time."
And who does that better than Lin-Manuel Miranda?
That's right. Absolutely.
So this building that Luke Cage stands in front of in Harlem, it bears the name of Crispus Attucks. Is that a historical, real building?
While there are many schools, parks, theaters, playgrounds, and community centers named in honor of Crispus Attucks, that structure is fictitious and made up for the show.
Oh, that's convenient. It seems odd, though, that so many do exist and they happen to choose to make one up.
Right. Well, I believe that's because the show is set in Harlem and there's not anything that I could find named after him in Harlem specifically.
Fair enough. And hey, well, you look at that. We pretty much almost hit our 10-minute goal for our 10-minute histories.
Yeah, finally.
That's right. I told you I was the more long-winded one. That's right. We almost doubled the time limit when we were talking about the Declaration of Independence. So unless you were listening to us at double speed, listening to us like chipmunks, then you probably didn't hear that episode in 10 minutes or less.
As always, you can get into contact with us. Contact@graphocast.com. Check us out on Twitter @graphocast. And if you'd like to support us and get some exclusives, check out patreon.com/graphocast.
Well, thanks for listening to another episode of our 10-minute histories on Hamilton the Podcast, a production from Graphomania Podcast Network.
Until next week, I'm Vinton Bain @FleshEater on Twitter.
And I'm Robbie Herlocker @Alpha Knight.
This has been a Graphomania production. If you would like to hear more podcasts, go to graphocast.com, graphocast.com. Follow us on Twitter @graphocast and like the Graphomania page on Facebook for news and updates.